The steady, mechanical hiss of the ventilator was the only pulse left in the VIP suite, a rhythmic metronome counting down the final moments of a billion-dollar empire. Kyung-soo lay beneath the sterile white linens, a fallen titan of the underworld whose tattooed hands, once capable of crushing rivals, now rested limp and waxen. His brother stood at the window, checking an expensive gold watch with cold impatience, while his fiancée adjusted her mourning veil in the mirror. To them, he was already a ghost, a brain-dead obstacle waiting to be cleared from the path of their ambition. He was surrounded by power, yet he was utterly powerless. Then, Sadia stepped out of the shadows. As she adjusted his IV drip, her fingers, warm and steady, brushed against his cold temple. She leaned down, her dark eyes scanning the room before her lips nearly touched the shell of his ear. She didn't offer a prayer, she whispered a warning. Atlanta, the poison was in the tea. They are coming for you tonight. In that split second, the monitors didn't just beep, they screamed. Kyung-soo's pupils, fixed and dilated just moments ago, suddenly contracted into sharp points of dark fire. Beneath the heavy blankets, a single scarred finger jerked with violent, sudden life. The brain-dead king was no longer dead. He was listening.
Welcome to Afro-Korean Mafia love thrillers, the home of dark romance, brutal betrayals, forbidden passion, and revenge that cuts deep. Here, we explore deep, emotional, and thrilling love stories between African women and Korean men, stories filled with passion, culture clash, forbidden love, secrets, sacrifice, and destiny. From tender romance to intense drama, from heartbreak to healing, every story pulls you into a world where love crosses borders and challenges expectations. If you love stories where powerful men fall for the one woman they were never supposed to love, and vice versa, where enemies become lovers, and where every choice has a deadly consequence, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe to this thrilling channel, like and share this video, because every week we bring you heart-pounding mafia love stories that will keep you hooked till the very last word. Now sit back, because this story is about to blow your mind. Now, let's get back to our story.
Sadia lingered by the monitor, her shadow stretching long across the sterile linoleum as the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind Kyung-soo's brother. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic, artificial sigh of the ventilator. To the guards outside, she was just a nurse performing a routine check. To the traders in the hallway, she was tending to a man who was already a memory. But as she leaned over the bed, Sadia saw what the expensive diagnostic machines had missed. She looked at Kyung-soo's face, a mask of frozen power etched with scars that told stories of 1,000 battles, and felt a surge of protective fire. Reaching into the deep pocket of her scrubs, she pulled out a small amber vial she had intercepted from the morning's discarded medical waste. It wasn't a standard hospital sedative. Her father back in Senegal had taught her the scent of the Earth's most silent killers, and this smelled of bitter almonds and betrayal. "They think you're gone, Kyung-soo," she murmured, her voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to ripple through the stagnant air of the suite. She leaned closer, her lips inches from his ear, ensuring her words were for him alone. "They call it brain death, but I see the way your pulse jumps when your fiancé speaks of the inheritance. They aren't mourning you, they're measuring the casket." She watched the jagged green line on the heart rate monitor. It was steady, dangerously steady. "I found the vial," she whispered, her hand closing tightly over the amber glass. "It wasn't the crash that put you here. It was the tea you drank in Atlanta. Your brother didn't just want your chair. He wanted your pulse to stop forever. He's coming back tonight to sign the papers to end this. If you can hear me, Kyung-soo, you have to fight the toxin. You have to wake up, or you'll be buried with the truth." For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then a sharp electric chirp echoed from the bedside unit. The steady rhythm broke into a frantic, gallop-like tempo. On the screen, the heart rate leaped from a resting 60 to a staggering 140. The green line became a series of violent mountain peaks. Kyung-soo's chest rose in a jagged, uneven heave against the machine's forced air. Sadia's breath caught as she saw a single bead of sweat break across his brow. The corpse was screaming from the inside. She quickly adjusted the settings on the monitor to dampen the alarm before the guards could burst in, her heart hammering in sync with his. "That's it," she hissed, pressing her palm against his trembling hand. "Fight it. Don't let the darkness take you. I'm the only one who knows you're still in there, and I'm not letting them turn out the lights." Beneath the sheets, Kyung-soo's hand didn't just twitch, it gripped the fabric with a white-knuckled desperation that nearly tore the linen. The king had heard his sentence, and he was finally clawing his way back to the throne. The door to the VIP suite creaked open, and the heavy, expensive scent of sandalwood and cold rain preceded Kyung-soo's brother, Junho, into the room. Sadia immediately stepped back, her face becoming a neutral mask of professional indifference, though her skin still tingled from the heat of Kyung-soo's surging pulse. Junho didn't look at his brother as a human being. He looked at him as a locked vault he was finally about to crack. He stood at the foot of the bed, his dark suit impeccably tailored, and sighed with a theatricality that made Sadia's stomach turn. Behind him, the fiancée, Mina, leaned against the wall, her eyes cold and calculating as they swept over the expensive medical machinery. "The lawyers are ready," Junho said, his voice smooth and devoid of grief. "Midnight, that's when we sign the transition of power. The doctors have given us the final paperwork for the disconnection. It's better this way. He wouldn't want to live as a shell." Mina stepped forward, her fingers tracing the edge of the bed frame near Kyung-soo's immobile hand. "Are you sure he can't hear us?" she whispered, a flicker of genuine fear crossing her face. "They say sometimes, even when the brain is dark, they're still watching." Junho laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "He's meat, Mina. The doctors in Atlanta did their job well. The toxin ensured there would be no recovery. By tomorrow morning, Kyung-soo will be a memory, and this empire will finally belong to someone who knows how to use it." Beneath the surface, Kyung-soo was a prisoner in a tomb of his own flesh. He heard every word, every callous laugh, and every admission of the betrayal that had shattered his life. The rage was a physical weight in his chest, a roaring fire that screamed for release. He felt the urge to roar, to leap from the bed and wrap his hands around his brother's throat, but his muscles remained unresponsive, locked in the chemical chains of the poison. Sadia caught a glimpse of Kyung-soo's eyes, just a sliver of dark iris beneath the lids. They weren't the eyes of a dying man. They were the eyes of a predator watching from the tall grass. "I need to check his vitals," Sadia interrupted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "Please, give me a moment alone with the patient." Junho gave a dismissive wave and exited with Mina, their voices fading into the hallway as they discussed the celebratory dinner they had planned for the following evening. The moment the door latched, Sadia leaned over Kyung-soo. "I need you to wake up. They're coming at midnight. You have 4 hours. You have to show them that the king isn't dead." Kyung-soo's jaw tightened, a movement so small it was almost invisible, but to Sadia, it was a thunderclap. He was a ghost no longer. He was a weapon being forged in the dark. Sadia felt the weight of the cameras before she even looked up. The VIP wing was no longer a place of healing, it was a glass cage. Every movement she made was being scrutinized by Junho's security team on the monitors in the basement. She knew that if she were caught with anything other than standard hospital supplies, she wouldn't just lose her job, she would lose her life. The blessing people spoke of wasn't just her spirit, it was her knowledge. Hidden within the lining of her medical bag was a concentrated neural stimulant she had distilled from rare roots, a secret passed down through generations of healers. It was the only thing capable of flushing the Atlanta toxin from Kyung-soo's system before the midnight deadline. As she walked toward the supply closet, a hand gripped her shoulder. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned to find a tall, stone-faced guard staring down at her. "What's in the bag, nurse?" he rasped, his eyes narrow and suspicious. "Standard saline and fresh linens," Sadia replied, her voice remarkably flat, a testament to years of masking her fear. "Unless you'd like to change the Mafia boss's soiled sheets yourself?" The guard sneered, his gaze lingering on the bag for a long, agonizing moment before he stepped back. "Make it fast. The family doesn't want any complications before the papers are signed." Sadia slipped into the supply room, her hands trembling as she pulled a small syringe from the hidden seam of her bag. She didn't have much time. She reached into a box of standard vitamin B12 ampules, carefully swapping one for her dark herbal concentrate. Returning to the room, she found Kyung-soo exactly as she had left him, but the air felt charged, as if a storm were about to break. She leaned over his arm, pretending to check the IV site while the cameras watched from above. "They're watching us, Kyung-soo," she whispered, her hair shielding her face from the lens in the corner. "This is gonna feel like fire in your veins. Don't move, don't make a sound. If they see you react, we're both dead." She depressed the plunger, sending the dark liquid into his bloodstream. Almost instantly, the man beneath her hands began to vibrate. It wasn't a seizure, it was a systemic awakening. Kyung-soo's skin turned a feverish red, and his jaw locked so hard the bone threatened to snap. His eyes remained shut, but Sadia could feel the raw, agonizing power of a man being dragged back from the brink of the abyss. "Stay with me," she breathed, pressing her forehead against his, masking the sight of his strained, bulging neck veins from the cameras. The midnight countdown had begun, and the ghost was finally growing teeth. The neural stimulant hit Kyung-soo's system like a lightning strike, turning his veins into conduits of liquid fire. Inside the tomb of his body, the dormant nerves began to scream, firing off signals that had been silent for 6 months. Suddenly, his right leg bucked, a violent, involuntary spasm that sent a thud echoing through the quiet room. Sadia's heart leaped into her throat. She looked up at the black dome of the security camera, its red light blinking like a predatory eye. Any second, the guards in the basement would see the corpse kicking and realize the brain death was a lie. "Don't let go," she hissed, throwing her entire weight across her lower body to pin his thrashing limbs to the mattress. She grabbed a bottle of unscented massage oil from the bedside table, flipping the cap and pouring it liberally over her hands. As the next spasm sent Kyung-soo's back arching off the bed, she began to rub his muscles with a forceful, rhythmic intensity. To anyone watching the monitor, it looked like a standard palliative care massage, a nurse trying to prevent muscle atrophy in a dying man. "Breathe through it, Kyung-soo," she whispered, her sweat dripping onto his chest. "Focus on my voice. Channel the fire into your fingers, not your limbs. Small movements, controlled." Beneath her palms, Kyung-soo's muscles were as hard as iron. The chemical battle was raging. The blessing was tearing through the Atlanta toxin, but the cost was agony. His teeth ground together with such force she feared they would shatter, and a low, guttural vibration started in his throat. Sadia leaned in, masking his face with her shoulder as she manipulated his arms in a wide, stretching motion. "They're coming in 2 hours," she breathed, her eyes locked on the door. "Junho thinks he's signing a death warrant. You need to make sure he's signing his own confession." Suddenly, the violent shaking stopped. Kyung-soo's body went limp, but it wasn't the limpness of death. It was the stillness of a spring being coiled. Sadia felt a hand, a real living hand, brush against her wrist. It wasn't a spasm, it was a deliberate, white-knuckled grip. Kyung-soo's eyes didn't open, but his fingers squeezed hers with a strength that nearly crushed her bones. The recovery was no longer a miracle, it was a weapon. Sadia exhaled a shaky breath, smoothing the sheets back over him just as the heavy tread of combat boots sounded in the hallway. The midnight guards were making their rounds early. The clock on the wall struck 11:45, its ticking sounding like a hammer against a nail. The doors swung open with a cold, final thud. Junho entered first, flanked by two men in suits carrying leather briefcases and a doctor who refused to meet Sadia's eyes. Behind them, Mina lingered, her black lace veil pulled back to reveal a face devoid of anything but cold anticipation. "It's time," Junho announced, his voice slicing through the sterile air. He didn't look at his brother. He looked at the mahogany table, where the lawyers were already spreading out the documents that would officially declare Kyung-soo dead in the eyes of the law and the board of directors. Sadia stood by the ventilator, her hand subtly resting on the power cord. She could feel the heat radiating from Kyung-soo's body. The blessing was working too well. His skin was flushing, and his chest was beginning to fight the rhythm of the machine. If the doctor stepped close enough to check his pupils now, the game would be over before the ink was dry. "Wait," Sadia said, her voice sharp enough to make the lawyers pause. "His intracranial pressure is spiking. If you disturb the bed now, he could have a terminal seizure. The transition needs to be stable or the autopsy will show medical negligence." Junho's eyes narrowed. "The machines say he's a flatline, nurse. Don't play hero now." "Look at the monitor," Sadia countered, her heart racing. She reached behind the bedside unit and discreetly loosened the primary sensor lead. On the screen, the steady heart rate suddenly plummeted into a chaotic, jagged mess of red lines. An alarm began to wail, a high-pitched, piercing shriek that signaled immediate cardiac failure. "He's crashing!" Sadia cried, lunging toward Kyung-soo's chest. She began to perform chest compressions, not to save his heart, but to use her body to shield him from their view. Each time she leaned down, she whispered into his ear, "Stay still. Don't react to the pain. Just a few more minutes." "Fix it," Junho roared, backing away from the bed in disgust. The sight of the corpse convulsing under Sadia's hands was too much for his cowardice. "I don't care what it takes. Keep him alive long enough for the notary to witness the signature. I won't have this contested because he died 5 minutes too early." As the room descended into the planned chaos of her fake crisis, Sadia watched through the sweat stinging her eyes as Junho grabbed the pen. He was so desperate to escape the room that he didn't even read the final clauses. He signed with a flourish of greedy triumph. Beneath Sadia's hands, Kyung-soo remained a statue of iron, his endurance superhuman. He felt the weight of her compressions, the roar of the alarms, and the betrayal of his brother's voice, but he didn't blink. The papers were stamped. The notary nodded. The empire had been stolen. "We're done here," Junho spat, gesturing for the lawyers to leave. "Nurse, once he stabilizes, turn it off. I don't want to be called back here again." The heavy doors closed. The silence returned, heavier than before. Sadia slumped against the bed rails, gasping for air. She reached up and reattached the sensor. The monitor returned to a strong, steady, and very conscious rhythm. Slowly, Kyung-soo's eyes opened. They weren't the eyes of a patient. They were the eyes of a ghost who had just watched his own murder and was ready for the resurrection. Kyung-soo didn't move at first. He remained as still as the meat his brother had called him, but the air in the room had shifted from the stagnant scent of death to the sharp ozone charge of an approaching storm. Sadia stood frozen, her hand still resting on the sensor lead, watching as the man who had been a living corpse for 6 months slowly turned his head toward her. His eyes were bloodshot, the vessels shattered from the strain of the blessing fighting the poison, but the gaze was terrifyingly lucid. He looked at her not with the gratitude of a patient, but with the cold, calculating intensity of a predator who had just memorized the face of his only ally. "The tea," he rasped. The sound was like dry leaves scraping against stone, a voice unused for half a year and scarred by the intubation tube. He coughed, a violent hacking sound that shook his entire frame, and Sadia rushed to support him, pressing a cup of water to his cracked lips. He drank greedily, his hand trembling as it covered hers on the plastic cup. "You said Atlanta?" he whispered, his voice gaining a jagged edge. "How do you know about the tea?" Sadia didn't flinch. I grew up in a house of healers, Kyung-soo. My father taught me that nature provides the antidote, but man provides the delivery. I found the traces of the toxin in your blood work, traces the hospital's automated systems were told to ignore. But the scent, it was distinct. It was a blend used only by the old families in Georgia. It wasn't just a hit, it was a signature. Kyung-soo's grip on her hand tightened until her bones groaned. It was more than a signature. It was a message. My brother didn't act alone. He made a deal with the Atlanta syndicate to expand our operations. I refused. I told them the Korean soil was not for sale. He looked toward the closed door where his brother had just exited. He didn't just want the throne. He wanted to sell it to the highest bidder. He thought if he killed me there, it would look like a gang war. He didn't realize I'd make it back to Seoul. You made it back, Sadia said softly, but you brought the poison with you. Kyung-soo looked at her, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. And I found the only person in this city who wasn't on the payroll. Why? Why risk your life for a man the world calls a monster? Sadia looked at the monitor, where his heart was beating with a fierce, rhythmic defiance. Because even a monster deserves to face his executioners on his feet, and because I've spent my life watching powerful men pull the plug on those they think are too weak to fight back, I wanted to see what happens when the weak one wakes up. Kyung-soo let out a low, dark chuckle that turned into another cough. He leaned back against the pillows, the fire in his eyes burning brighter. Then watch closely, Sadia, because by dawn they're going to realize that pulling the plug was the safest thing they could have done. He reached out, his fingers brushing the stethoscope around her neck. I can't trust my men. I can't trust my family, but I can trust the woman who whispered the truth into a dead man's ear. Hide me. If they find out I'm truly awake before I can move, we both die.
The shadows in the hallway shifted as the 2 a.m. shift change began, but the footsteps echoing toward the VIP suite were too heavy, too synchronized for nurses. Inside the room, the monitor Sadia had hacked was showing a feed from the service elevator. 3 men in delivery uniforms, their hands buried deep in pockets that clearly concealed suppressed weapons. Jun-ho wasn't waiting for the morning. He had sent a cleanup crew to ensure the brain-dead king never had the chance to rot. "They're here," Sadia whispered, her voice tight with a calm born of pure adrenaline. Kyung-soo tried to sit up, but his muscles, still clearing the last of the Atlanta toxin, buckled. He fell back against the pillows, a muffled curse escaping his lips. "I can't. My legs are still lead." "Then don't be a man," Sadia said, her mind racing through the limited options of the high-security ward. "Be a patient." She moved with a blur of efficiency. She didn't try to hide him in a closet. She did the opposite. She stripped the high-end silk sheets and replaced them with the cheap, scratchy cotton of a standard ward. She pulled a mobile privacy screen around the bed and grabbed a bottle of iodine, splashing it onto a fresh bandage she slapped over his forehead, obscuring his recognizable features. "Stay limp," she commanded. "If you breathe too deeply, the bandage moves. If you move, we die." The door hissed open. The lead hitman stepped in, his eyes scanning the room with clinical coldness. He didn't look for a Mafia boss. He looked for the man in the VIP bed, but the bed was empty. Sadia was hunched over a gurney in the corner, her back to them, seemingly busy with a new patient she was prepping for transport to the morgue. "Where is he?" the hitman rasped, his hand tightening on the silencer beneath his jacket. "Room 402, Sadia replied, without turning, her voice muffled by a surgical mask. "The family moved him 5 minutes ago for private reasons. I'm just clearing the linens." The men exchanged a glance. The lead nodded, and they vanished back into the corridor, their silencers drawn as they sprinted toward the wrong room. Kyung-soo's hand shot out from under the gurney sheet, grabbing Sadia's wrist. His eyes were wide, the dark fire now mixed with a begrudging respect. "You just lied to the most dangerous men in Seoul." "I've been lying to your brother for 3 weeks, she breathed, her heart hammering so hard it was audible in the quiet room. "But they'll figure it out in 90 seconds. We have to move, now." She didn't wait for his permission. She unlocked the wheels of the gurney. The boss was no longer a king. He was a fugitive in his own hospital, and Sadia was the only one holding the map to the exit.
The gurney rattled over the uneven transition into the darkened service corridor, the sound echoing like a drumbeat in the narrow space. Sadia pushed with everything she had, her muscles burning as she steered Kyung-soo toward the freight elevator. Behind them, a muffled shout erupted from the VIP wing. The hitmen had realized room 402 was a decoy. "Almost there," she hissed, her breath hitching. Suddenly, the elevator doors at the end of the hall dinged. A lone figure stepped out, not the trio from before, but a shadow in a long coat, his eyes catching the dim emergency light. He didn't hesitate. He drew a blade that shimmered with a wicked surgical edge. He was the cleaner, the one Jun-ho kept for the jobs that required no noise. Sadia scrambled to find a weapon, her hand closing around a heavy metal IV pole. She stepped in front of the gurney, shielding Kyung-soo with her own body. "Run!" she whispered over her shoulder, knowing full well he couldn't. The assassin lunged. Sadia swung the pole, but the man was a shadow, sliding past her defense with terrifying grace. He backhanded her, the force of the blow sending her crashing against the tiled wall. As she slumped to the floor dazed, the cleaner turned his attention back to the corpse on the gurney. He raised the blade, aiming for the soft tissue of the neck. "Goodbye, boss," the man rasped. A hand, scarred, tattooed, and surging with a terrifying, unnatural strength, clamped onto the assassin's wrist. The blessing had finally finished its work. Kyung-soo didn't just wake up, he exploded into motion. With a guttural roar of pure, concentrated rage, he threw his weight forward, his legs shaking but holding as he forced himself off the gurney. The sheer shock of the dead man standing upright froze the assassin for a fraction of a second, and in the Mafia, a second is an eternity. Kyung-soo used the man's own momentum to slam him into the industrial elevator frame. The sound of breaking bone cracked through the hall. Despite the lingering tremors in his muscles, Kyung-soo stood tall, towering over the assassin. He gripped the man's throat, his fingers sinking into the flesh with the same iron grip Sadia had felt earlier. "Tell my brother," Kyung-soo growled, his voice no longer a rasp, but a low, predatory rumble. "The king has returned from the grave." He dropped the unconscious man like a piece of trash and turned toward Sadia. He was swaying, his face pale from the exertion, but he reached out a hand to help her up. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted. He wasn't the patient, and she wasn't just the nurse. They were survivors. "You're bleeding," he said softly, his thumb brushing a small cut on her lip. "I've had worse," Sadia replied, taking his hand. "Can you walk?" Kyung-soo looked down at his feet, then back at the dark hallway where more footsteps were approaching. "For you, I'll run." The grand ballroom of the Hyatt was draped in white lilies and black silk, a scene of forced mourning for a man whose body was still warm in a hospital bed across town. Jun-ho stood at the center of the dais, a glass of vintage scotch in one hand and the signed power of attorney documents in the other. He smiled at the gathered heads of the underworld families, his voice booming with a false, practiced grief as he prepared to announce the new merger with the Atlanta syndicate. "My brother was a titan," Jun-ho proclaimed, his eyes glistening with crocodile tears. "But as he sleeps his final sleep, we must look to the future, to the growth he was too tired to see." Min-ah stood beside him, her black lace veil pushed back to reveal a triumphant smirk. She gripped her champagne glass like a scepter. They were seconds away from the final toast that would seal Kyung-soo's fate and sell his soul to his enemies. Then, the massive double doors at the back of the ballroom didn't just open, they were kicked off their hinges. The music died in a discordant screech of violins. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway, framed by the cold moonlight and the silhouettes of fallen guards, was a ghost.
Kyung-soo walked into the room, his gait slow but deliberate, each step sounding like a hammer on a coffin. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was dressed in the dark, blood-stained tactical gear he had stripped from the cleaner, his chest heaving with the effort of the resurrection. Beside him, Sadia walked with her head held high, her blue nurse's scrubs a sharp, defiant contrast to the sea of black silk. "My brother was a titan," Kyung-soo proclaimed, his eyes glistening with crocodile tears. "But as he sleeps his final sleep, we must look to the future, to the growth he was too tired to see." Kyung-soo stepped onto the dais, his presence so overwhelming that Jun-ho collapsed into a chair, his bravado vanishing like smoke. Kyung-soo leaned down, his face inches from his brother. "I am the living legend," Kyung-soo whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. "And legends don't die in hospital beds. They die on their feet, taking their enemies with them." He turned to the crowd, his arm around Sadia. "This woman saved the king. Now the king is going to burn the kingdom down."
The sirens of the police and rival clans echoed in the distance, but inside the grand ballroom, the fire had already done its work. Kyung-soo didn't wait for the authorities to arrive. He had exposed the truth, and in the world of the syndicate, exposure was a death sentence far more final than any poison. He turned his back on the throne, the documents, and the trembling remains of his family, his hand never leaving Sadia's. An hour later, they stood on the edge of the Incheon harbor, the salt air stinging the cuts on Kyung-soo's face. He watched as a sleek, nondescript black car pulled up. A loyal lieutenant stepped out, handing over 2 passports and a thick envelope of untraceable currency. "It's done, boss," the man whispered. "The world thinks you died in the explosion at the Hyatt. The records at the hospital have been erased. Kyung-soo is officially a ghost." Kyung-soo looked at the passports. They weren't for a king and his servant. They were for 2 strangers. He turned to Sadia, the moonlight reflecting in his dark, weary eyes. "I have spent my life building a cage of gold and blood," he said, his voice finally clear, stripped of the Mafia's gravel. "I was brain dead long before I met you, Sadia. I was a man who felt nothing, owned everything, and lived for no one." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles that had fought to keep his heart beating. "You gave me a blessing I didn't deserve. You gave me a second life. I want to spend it being the man you whispered to when the rest of the world was waiting for me to turn cold." Sadia smiled, the tension finally leaving her shoulders as she looked out at the dark horizon of the sea. "The king is dead, Kyung-soo, but the man has a long way to go." "Then let's start walking," he replied. They stepped into the car, leaving the burning wreckage of a criminal empire behind. As the sun began to peek over the Incheon skyline, a new horizon opened up, one where there were no bosses, no toxins, and no whispers in the dark. Only the steady, healthy rhythm of a heart that had finally found a reason to beat.